Fame, they say, is a promise that never keeps itself. For Al Pacino, that promise came wrapped in applause, awards, and adoration, but it left him standing alone at 85, looking back at a life that was both magnificent and quietly tragic.
The camera flashes once blinded him. The crowds outside theaters chanted his name like a hymn, Pacino, Pacino, as if they were greeting a god, not a man. Today, those same lights are softer, and the cheers have turned into whispers. In the quiet corners of Beverly Hills, Al Pacino often walks unnoticed, hidden behind dark glasses, his gait slower, his presence gentler. To the world, he is still the lion of American cinema, the living embodiment of power and passion. But beneath that immortal image lies a man haunted by isolation, regret, and a love story that never found its ending. It's hard to imagine that the man who gave life to Michael Corleone, Tony Montana, and Frank Slade, the faces of cinematic immortality, now spends his evenings alone. His once commanding voice reduced to quiet reflections. In public, he still performs the charm. A slow smile, a soft laugh, a sharp line that reminds everyone the fire hasn't gone out. But when the curtains fall, the silence returns, and it's heavier than applause ever was. Pacino's life has always been about contradiction. The more successful he became, the more he seemed to retreat inward. He turned down marriage again and again, fathered children late in life, and chose solitude over companionship. Friends describe him as a man forever rehearsing, even off camera, lost in his thoughts, replaying lines from roles that shaped him, as though he couldn't separate the script from himself anymore. There's a moment few know. In 2010, after a rare onstage appearance in New York, Pacino stayed in the empty theater for over an hour, sitting alone in the dark, saying to a stagehand, "This is the only place I know who I am." That quiet confession revealed what fame had taken. The man behind the legend, blurred by decades of performance. And yet, for all the loneliness, the tragedy of Al Pacino isn't about being forgotten. It's about being remembered for everything except who he truly is. His story isn't a fall from grace. It's the slow erosion of a soul consumed by its own greatness. The question that lingers is not how Al Pacino lived, but what he sacrificed for us to remember him. Because behind every unforgettable role, there was a man quietly breaking. As the world applauded the rise of a cinematic god, no one noticed the child who never stopped searching for the father he lost.
Before he was Al Pacino, he was just Sonny, a skinny kid running through the cracked sidewalks of the South Bronx, clutching dreams too fragile for the world around him. Born Alfredo James Pacino in 1940 to Italian-American parents, his earliest memories weren't of glamour or art, but of absence. His father walked out when he was 2. His mother, Rose, carried the weight of survival on her back, working endless hours while her son drifted between relatives in dark hallways. Poverty wasn't a background noise, it was the rhythm of his childhood. He would later say that he grew up surrounded by noise but feeling invisible. The Bronx in the 1940s was a place where kids learned to fight before they learned to read, where men shouted in bars and women prayed in kitchens. For Al, the stage would become his church, the only place where silence could turn into power. But before he found that light, there was a long stretch of darkness. When his mother died at 43, Al was only 22. That wound never closed. He spoke of her often, softly, saying that before every major role, he still talked to her in his head, not out of ritual, but because she was the one thing he had always wanted to save and couldn't. School never fit him. He was expelled more than once, called a dreamer, a troublemaker, a waste. He worked small jobs, janitor, messenger, theater usher, while chasing a vision that no one else could see. Friends from those years remember him sitting on stoops for hours, watching people pass by, mimicking their voices, studying their gestures. He could make you laugh or cry in a second, one childhood friend recalled. We didn't understand it, but it felt like he was meant for something bigger. He auditioned for the High School of Performing Arts in Manhattan and found, for the first time, a space that mirrored his chaos. Acting gave shape to what was burning inside him. But even then, the road ahead was cruel. He was rejected multiple times by studios and theater companies, including the famous Actors Studio. Years later, he would become one of its most iconic members. But back then, he was just another broke kid walking miles because he couldn't afford the subway. He sometimes borrowed money to eat or went hungry through rehearsal, hiding his hunger behind intensity. A small-time director named Charlie Lawton saw what others missed. Lawton became a mentor, a quiet guide who recognized the vulnerability behind Pacino's fire. He taught him that acting wasn't about pretending to feel something. It was about remembering what it meant to feel at all. Lawton became the father figure Al never had. Under his direction, Pacino learned how to channel pain into truth, fear into electricity. By his mid-20s, he was performing off-Broadway, earning $5 a show, sleeping on friends' couches. But the small stages were sacred. Under flickering lights, he could vanish into another life, and for a brief moment feel real. The tragedy of his youth wasn't only poverty or loss, it was the discovery that the only way to be seen was to stop being himself.
The late 1960s were unforgiving years for dreamers in New York. Broadway was shrinking, television was taking over, and the film industry was in flux. But for Al Pacino, who had spent years playing to half-empty rooms in forgotten theaters, this chaos felt like an opening. His performances were raw, unpredictable, and deeply human. Too intense for some, mesmerizing for others. He wasn't a handsome lead in the traditional Hollywood sense. He was small, dark-eyed, and restless. Yet when he stepped into a role, something extraordinary happened. The room changed. The turning point came in 1969, when he starred in the stage production Does a Tiger Wear a Necktie on Broadway. The play itself was a failure, but Pacino's performance was electric. He won a Tony Award for it, his first taste of validation after years of obscurity. "It was the first time I felt like I belonged in this world," he later said. That single recognition pulled him from the edges of anonymity straight into Hollywood's radar. Then came the audition that changed his life, and arguably the face of American cinema. In 1971, director Francis Ford Coppola saw Pacino in a small off-Broadway show and insisted that he was perfect for a film adaptation of The Godfather. The studio executives balked. They wanted a big name, not an unknown theater actor with little screen experience. Coppola fought for him relentlessly, calling Pacino a real soul among mannequins. Pacino nearly didn't get the part. After multiple auditions and studio objections, he was finally cast as Michael Corleone, a quiet, reluctant heir to a violent empire. He was 29, anxious, and carrying every scar of his past into the role. On set, he felt out of place among giants like Marlon Brando and James Caan. But when the cameras rolled, everything fell away. The performance that emerged was haunting, cold, restrained, terrifyingly calm. By the time The Godfather premiered in 1972, Pacino was no longer a struggling actor. He was a phenomenon. The role earned him his first Academy Award nomination and rewrote what Hollywood thought a leading man could be. Gone was the polished hero. In his place stood a man of contradictions, tender yet ruthless, fragile yet unbreakable. Success, however, came with its first crack. Pacino struggled with the sudden glare of fame. He hated interviews, avoided red carpets, and retreated into solitude. While other stars basked in attention, he seemed to shrink from it. He once said, "It was like they build a house around you overnight and tell you it's home, but you don't even recognize the walls."
The following years brought Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, and Justice for All, films that cemented his reputation as the defining actor of a generation. Yet behind the triumphs, a familiar loneliness grew. Fame had opened doors, but closed something inside him. He once said that every role he played took something from him, a small piece that never came back. The man who had fought so hard to be seen was now beginning to understand the cost of visibility. By the mid-1970s, Al Pacino wasn't just a movie star, he was a cultural force. His face stared down from billboards, his voice was quoted in living rooms, and his eyes, those unblinking, restless eyes, became symbols of American rebellion. Hollywood had crowned a new kind of leading man, not polished and perfect, but wounded, unpredictable, and alive. With The Godfather Part 2, Dog Day Afternoon, and Serpico, Pacino didn't just act, he inhabited. Each role was a confrontation between man and system, morality and madness. The 1974 release of The Godfather Part 2 elevated him to mythic status. As Michael Corleone transformed from reluctant heir to ruthless ruler, Pacino's performance redefined what cinematic power looked like. He barely raised his voice, yet every silence was deafening. Critics called it Shakespearean in stillness. Coppola later said that Pacino didn't play Michael, he became the cold heart of the film. The movie swept the Oscars, and Hollywood finally understood Al Pacino was no longer the outsider. He was the axis around which great cinema revolved. Fame, however, never sat comfortably on him. He was notoriously private, often disappearing for months between projects. He avoided the Hollywood party circuit, preferring long walks through Manhattan or quiet dinners with friends from his theater days. He was always half there, recalled one producer. Even in success, he seemed to be elsewhere, like part of him never left the Bronx. Behind the scenes, the demands were relentless. Directors found him brilliant but exhausting, perfectionist to the point of obsession. On Dog Day Afternoon, he shot a single scene 48 times. During And Justice for All, he refused to take shortcuts, rewriting dialogue until it rang true. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing truth, the kind that felt almost painful to hold. But in chasing that truth, he began to lose the balance that had once grounded him. The more real his performances became, the less real his life felt. Friends described his apartments as dimly lit, filled with scripts, photographs, and coffee cups, a space where day and night blurred. He barely slept, often pacing, reciting lines, or staring at the ceiling in silence. His relationships faltered under the weight of his intensity. Although surrounded by women who adored him, including co-stars and Hollywood legends, Pacino remained unanchored. He wanted love, one former partner said, but he was married to the work. He never married, and as years passed, that choice became a quiet wound he rarely spoke about. In 1983, Scarface hit theaters, a role that would both immortalize and distort him. As Tony Montana, Pacino was larger than life, vulgar and magnetic, embodying greed and ambition in their purest forms. The film polarized critics, but became a cult phenomenon, quoted and worshipped by generations. For audiences, it was Al Pacino unleashed. For him, it was a descent, another character that consumed him long after filming ended. After Scarface, I couldn't sleep for weeks. Tony was still in me, and I didn't know how to shut him off. The irony was brutal. The higher he climbed, the lonelier the air became. Awards piled up, scripts flooded in, and yet he seemed to be fading behind his own legend. The man who had once fought to be seen now hid behind his characters, afraid of what remained when the camera stopped rolling. By the end of the decade, Al Pacino was untouchable in reputation and utterly unreachable in spirit.
By the early 1980s, Al Pacino had become something larger than an actor. He was an institution. But every institution, even the most revered, eventually begins to crack from within. Fame for Pacino was both armor and poison. The applause that once lifted him now echoed back with emptiness. Each role demanded more of him, carving deeper into his psyche, until the line between performance and existence almost disappeared. After Scarface, he took a step back. Publicly, it was about recharging. Privately, it was survival. He had pushed himself into exhaustion, both physical and emotional. The intensity that made him great was starting to consume him. His friends noticed his withdrawal, missed calls, sleepless nights, a haunted stare. He was always acting, one of them said, even when the cameras weren't rolling. The 1980s were a strange decade for Pacino. Hollywood was changing. The blockbuster era had arrived, and subtle, character-driven films were falling out of favor. Pacino's style, once revolutionary, began to feel out of step. After a string of critical disappointments, Revolution in 1985 being the most infamous, he all but vanished from the screen. The man who had ruled the 1970s found himself unwanted, misunderstood, and for the first time, irrelevant. He later admitted that Revolution nearly ended his career. The film was a commercial and artistic disaster. "I lost my way," he told Vanity Fair years later. "I didn't know what I was chasing anymore." Disillusioned, he retreated to the stage, returning to his first love, theater, performing in small productions with little fanfare. For someone of his stature, it looked like a downfall, but for Pacino, it was a kind of refuge. "On stage, I could breathe again," he said. Still, the isolation deepened. Decades of living in other people's skin had left him estranged from his own. He never turned to hard drugs like some of his contemporaries, but he wrestled with depression and chronic insomnia. There were whispers of drinking, of volatile moods, of nights spent alone in dark hotel rooms with nothing but scripts and silence. His relationships remained fleeting. He had several partners, children born out of complicated romances, yet never a stable family life. "He didn't know how to stay," one woman said simply. The press began to turn on him. Once hailed as the god of American acting, Pacino became the target of criticism. Too loud, too theatrical, out of touch with the new generation. The same intensity that once thrilled audiences now seemed excessive. One headline from the New York Times in 1986 read, "Has Al Pacino lost his fire or been burned by it?" Behind the scenes, his longtime mentor, Charlie Lawton, died in 1985. It was a quiet death, barely noted in the press, but for Pacino, it was an earthquake. Lawton had been his compass, the one man who saw him as human rather than icon. Without him, Pacino was adrift. "He was the last person who knew me before all this," Pacino later reflected. And yet, even in this darkness, there were glimmers of the man he had always been, disciplined, searching, unwilling to give up. During those years of obscurity, he spent time teaching acting workshops, working with young actors, reminding them that truth mattered more than fame. One student remembered him saying quietly, "The hardest part of this job is learning to come back to yourself." But at that point, Pacino himself no longer knew where himself was.
By the early 1990s, the world had almost forgotten Al Pacino. A decade of silence had turned one of cinema's loudest voices into a whisper. Then, as if emerging from the ashes, he returned, not as the young lion of the 1970s, but as a man who had seen the cost of his own myth. Sea of Love, 1989, and Dick Tracy, 1990, marked his re-entry, but it was Scent of a Woman in 1992 that resurrected him entirely. The role of Colonel Frank Slade, a blind, broken ex-soldier drowning in pride and despair, was no coincidence. It was Pacino himself in disguise. That performance, rich with both rage and tenderness, was a mirror to his own life, aging, scarred, still burning. When he delivered the now legendary line, "I'm just getting warmed up," it felt less like acting and more like defiance. The Academy finally honored him with an Oscar, but those close to him say he accepted it with quiet melancholy, as if the prize had arrived 2 decades too late. He was back, but something in him had shifted. In interviews from that period, Pacino spoke about time as if it were an adversary, how fame steals it, how regret fills it, and how you wake one morning realizing you've lived most of your life pretending to be someone else. Even as his career revived, his personal life remained fractured. He had 3 children with different women, but never married, describing himself as too restless, too unsure of the world to promise permanence. Then came the years of solitude. In his late 60s and 70s, Pacino became a ghostly figure in Hollywood, appearing in bursts of brilliance, The Devil's Advocate, Insomnia, The Irishman, and then vanishing for years. He refused the conventional path of aging gracefully in the spotlight. He seemed to choose distance over decay. "I don't want to live in nostalgia," he once said. "It's a beautiful prison." Behind the acclaim, however, were the quiet tragedies that defined his later life. In 2012, the death of his close friend and co-star, Philip Seymour Hoffman, shook him deeply. "He reminded me of myself at that age," Pacino confessed, "and losing him felt like losing that part of me that still believed in beginnings." The aging actor began to reflect more publicly on loneliness. He said, "I have love in my life, but no home in it," in a rare 2015 interview. Age only magnified that sense of isolation. As his contemporaries passed away, Brando, Nicholson's retreat, De Niro's own quiet withdrawal, Pacino became one of the last of a vanished era. Hollywood had changed beyond recognition. The scripts were thinner, the roles less complex, and the industry less forgiving for introspection. In recent years, reports have surfaced of Pacino's fragile health, long nights spent alone in his Los Angeles home, and brief sightings where he seemed frail, distant, but still dignified. Those who know him describe him as half in the world, half in memory. His once fiery energy has mellowed into a kind of stillness, the calm after a lifetime of storms. And yet perhaps the cruelest irony of all is that Pacino, who gave everything to make us feel alive, now drifts through his final years largely unseen. He has spoken of the stage as his only real home, but at 85, even that stage feels far away. The tragedy of Al Pacino isn't that he fell. It's that he gave so much of himself to the world that there was almost nothing left for him.
When history writes about Al Pacino, it will speak of brilliance, of performances that burned so fiercely they left permanent shadows on the walls of cinema. Yet to understand his legacy is to look beyond the films and into the man who carried them, a man who lived his art not as a profession, but as a condition of existence. Pacino changed the language of acting. Before him, heroes were clean and composed. After him, they were raw, conflicted, painfully human. He gave American cinema a vocabulary of truth, the trembling voice, the haunted stare, the slow eruption of anger that felt less like performance and more like confession. Directors still study his scenes to understand how emotion can live in silence. Younger actors, from Christian Bale to Adam Driver, have called him a blueprint for honesty. But legacy for Pacino has never been about influence. It has always been about cost. In one interview, he said softly, "I paid with time, and you don't get refunds." The fame that once defined him now feels like a distant echo. He rarely watches his own films. He speaks of his past as if it happened to someone else, saying, "I only know the man I am when the camera's on. When it stops, I start looking for him again." And yet, even in that search, there's a strange grace. His later years have brought moments of quiet redemption, mentoring young actors, appearing in intimate theater productions, speaking gently about the simplicity of living without expectation. Friends say that age has softened him, but not dulled him. He still reads scripts by candlelight. He still quotes Shakespeare at random. he still cries when he talks about his mother. In one of his final public appearances, Pacino was asked how he would like to be remembered. He paused for a long time, smiled faintly, and said, "As someone who loved the work and survived it." At 85, his steps may be slower, his voice more fragile, but his presence carries the weight of 5 decades of truth-telling. His story, from the slums of the Bronx to the peaks of Hollywood, from isolation to immortality, remains a mirror of what fame truly is, not a crown, but a burden you learn to carry with dignity. The lights that once blinded him are dim now, but they haven't gone out. Somewhere between the applause and the silence, between the legend and the loneliness, Al Pacino has found a fragile kind of peace. Because behind the glory, what endures isn't the fame, it's the fight to remain human.
The tragedy of Al Pacino is not his solitude, nor the fading of youth. It lies in what his story reveals about the machinery of fame itself, how the same world that worships brilliance also devours it. Hollywood was never built to protect the souls it celebrates. It was built to consume them. Pacino's life reminds us that greatness often demands a kind of disappearance, a quiet surrender of self, so that others may feel, cry, and remember. For decades, he gave the world its heroes and villains, its triumphs and breakdowns, until the line between them no longer existed within him. At 85, he stands as both a warning and a wonder, proof that even in an industry obsessed with youth and noise, silence can still echo forever. Behind the glory, where legends live and where their humanity finally speaks.